consider a hypothetical market with demand QD equals 20 minus 2P. Once again, these are linear demands and supplies just for simplicity. Everything is easier. For example, finding consumers or producer surplus is easier once it is a linear demand and supply curve, because otherwise, if it is not linear, you have to calculate an integral in order to find an area between demand curve and the price line, right? But if it is a straight line, the area is going to be either rectangle or triangle, but so you don't really need any integral. So math is much easier. This is why we keep using linear demand supply curves. But again, this is oversimplification, obviously. In reality, you almost never observe a linear, it's not 2P, it's P, linear supply and demand curves. And by the way, estimating market demand and or supply is very critical sort of business. All right, so this is the market demand, this is the market supply. Calculate the perfectly competitive equilibrium price and quantity. Well, I mean, simple. Equilibrium price and quantity is when the quantity supply is equal to quantity demand, right? So the quantity supply is 2 plus P. Quantity demand is 20 minus 2P. So if you solve this, 3P equals 18, P equals 6. Good. Well then, if you plug it back to the supply curve or the demand curve, doesn't matter because they're going to be equal at that price level, you can find the quantity, which is 8. All right, so let's draw this because I think I will need this graph anyway. So this is quantity, this is price. So this is the demand curve. Let's figure out the intercepts. So when P is 0, quantity demand is 20. So this is 20. And when Q is 0, price can be 10. All right? I mean, again, this doesn't look like 10 versus 20, but well, so be it. And the quantity supply is when P is 0, quantity is 2. Yeah, okay, so it starts from here, be careful. And then afterwards, it's an increasing function like this. So we just calculated that the price is going to be 6 and the quantity is going to be 8. All right. Calculate the consumer and producer and total surplus. Show the consumer and producer surplus graphically. Well, all right. So the consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the price line. I shouldn't have done this because I'm going to use this graph later. Anyway, so the consumer surplus is this triangle, which is easy to find. 4 times 8 divided by 2, so it's 16 units. All right. Surplus doesn't have a unit. I mean, it's not kilo, it's not pound, it's not dollar. It's just unit. So when you don't have a unit, you just call it unit. Well, what about the producer surplus? So here, be careful, the demand curve doesn't start from the 0 point, and so it's not really a triangle, but you know, this is 2, be careful about it, and you know how to find this area, hopefully. If you don't know, that's fine, just find this big triangle, area of this big triangle, and then subtract this area of this small triangle, all right? So it's not a rocket science. But we know that the producer surplus is 2 plus this length, which is 8, times the height, which is 6 divided by 2. So it is 30 units. So the total surplus is always consumer surplus, producer surplus, guys. So it's 46 units. All right? That's it. Now, part C, imagine that government, I think that's the most important part. Imagine that government approves consumption tax of $3. All right, calculate the equilibrium prices of the buyers and the sellers after tax. All right, so there's going to be a tax in an amount of $3. So what does that mean? So here's a bit of story about how you should understand the tax. So you as a consumer go to a supermarket and buy this product, assuming that this product is sold in supermarkets. And so previously, it was $6, right? So what does that mean? That means you go to a supermarket you pay $6. I usually use credit card, but anyway, so you pay $6 and then the guy gives you the product. So that means I'm going to define, two things, P buyer and P seller. So P buyer is the price the buyer pays, and P seller is the price, money, all right, the money the seller receives. So in this case, in a perfectly competitive market, both of them are equal and they're equal to 6, right? The consumer has to pay $6 and the seller is going to receive $6 because the transaction is costless. However, when there's tax, so this is before tax. Now, after tax, what happens is there's a tax. So the consumer goes and pays something. Let's suppose $6. I mean, I don't know what the buyer's price, P buyer, will be, but the thing is, let's suppose he pays $6. Well, then how much the seller is going to receive? Well, do you think he's going to receive $6? Well, if you think literally, yes, he does receive $6, but this $3 tax must be paid to the government. So who's going to pay it? Usually the seller pays it, right? So let's think it as the seller is actually receiving $6, but then paying $3 to the government as a tax. So the remaining $3 is what he receives. So what does that mean? That means the buyer's price and the seller's price will no longer be equal once there's a tax. Well, what matters is the relationship between these two prices. So the this is how I'm going to denote it. By the way, I'm not going to keep writing P buyer. I'm going to write PB instead. So PB is going to be PS, the seller's price, plus 3. This is the tax amount. All right. So whatever the tax, if it is $3, well, this is 3. If it is $10, this is going to be 10. Right. So the buyers will always be paying something. The idea is the following: PB minus PS must be equal to the tax. And that's the idea. Well, obviously, this is not going to be the case. The seller's price minus buyer's price is T. Tax is a positive thing, all right? It's not minus. So therefore, the sellers cannot receive more than the buyers. And somebody has to pay the tax. Well, this is the case when there's a subsidy. Subsidy is basically the government gives money to the buyer or the seller. All right. So therefore, things are going to be different. But this is the tax scenario. Okay. So what am I going to do with this? Well, I need to find this PB and PS business. But if you go back to this graph, what the heck does that mean? That means the following. The buyer's price is going to be somewhere here, because it's higher, and the seller's price is going to be somewhere here. And the difference between these two, therefore, is the tax amount. The size is T. Remember my previous graph? This is exactly why I drove it. So this is the tax amount. This is the buyer's price that the buyers must be paying if they want to buy this good. And this is the price that the sellers must pay if they want to sell this good. I'm sorry, this is the sellers, this is the price, the amount of money the sellers will receive once they sell the good. I'm sorry. Net tax, obviously. All right, so that means what? So how can I find those prices? Well, kind of simple. We are in a perfectly competitive market, right? We must have supply equals demand, always. Okay, but the problem here is when we wrote QDQS, we have only one P. So here we have 2P, 2 price. So then what P is this? Is this the buyer's price? Is this the seller's price? So now here comes the tiny details which are very important. If you're talking about a demand curve, demand is what consumers drive, right? So consumers do not care about how much price sellers receive, right? I don't care about the grocery owner's amount of money he's basically putting in his pocket. What I do care is about how much money I pay. So therefore, if demand is representing my behavior, it should be my behavior given my price. Meaning, the quantity demand, the demand curve, is actually 20 minus 2p buyer. So as a buyer, I care about how much I pay. So therefore, my demand function should actually be written as this. And the QS, the supply curve, should actually be written as 2 plus PS. But when there is no transaction cost in a perfectly competitive market, meaning when there's no tax, for example, we didn't really bother writing PB, PS because they were the same thing. But now they're not. Okay, so once we have this, we still have the same idea, right? Perfectly competitive market means quantity supply equals quantity demand, meaning there shouldn't be any shortage, there shouldn't be any surplus. So if this is the idea of perfectly competitive market, what does that mean? That means quantity supply 2 plus PS must be equal to quantity demand, which is 20 minus 2 PB. So what does that mean? I can't solve this obviously because there are two parameters, two unknowns, but let's simplify it. PS plus 2PB equals 18. All right. The nice thing is I have one equation here, another equation here, right? Remember, the buyer's and the seller's price must satisfy this equality. So I have two unknowns, two equations, I can solve them. Let's solve them. So whenever you see PB, just plug PS plus 3 here. So this is going to be PS, all right, plus 2 times PB. Whenever I see PB, I'm going to write PS plus 3 equals 18. Very good. So if you simplify this, this is going to be 2 plus PS, so it's 3 PS. This is plus 6 equals 18. 3 PS equals 12. PS equals 4. Very good. Once I found PS, what is PB then? PB is equal to 4 plus 3, 7. So that means after tax, the buyers are going to pay $7. It's no longer 6. So after tax, price has increased. And the sellers, they're not going to be able to put $6 in their pocket, unfortunately. They're going to be able to put only $4. All right? So here, one thing that you can see, the difference between the buyer's final price and the initial price, well, final 7, initial 6. So there's one price increase. For seller, however, there's $2 decrease. So what does that mean? This $3 tax burden, we call it, is distributed between the buyers and the sellers. And one sort of unit of this tax is paid by the consumers, and 2 units of this is paid by the producers. So we call it tax burden for those who don't remember. So the tax burden for consumers is therefore PB minus P competitive equilibrium, which in this example 7 minus 6, which is 1. For producers, however, it is P competitive equilibrium minus PS, which in this case 6 minus 4, which is equal to 2. So one thing is that why this is not equally, this tax burden is not equally distributed. Why is that? Well, because supply curve is more, the demand curve is more inelastic than supply, and this is why the consumers are paying less. The opposite, here the consumers' demand curve is more elastic than the supply, and so therefore their tax burden is going to be less. Okay, and that's, by the way, sort of a standard argument. Whoever is more inelastic, consumers or producers, they pay the bigger portion of the tax. Think of, for example, gasoline or tobacco, alcohol. the consumer demand curves are highly inelastic. All right, so think it this way. So let's keep the supply curve fixed in two scenario, supply. And in one case, the demand curve is highly elastic. In the other, it's highly inelastic. All right. So if you apply the same amount of, tax, all right, as you see here, the supply side is going to suffer a bigger portion. Here, however, who suffers the bigger portion? Well, the consumers, because the consumer's burden is higher. So that means the relatively inelastic party is going to suffer the bigger portion. And this is basically why the governments usually, impose taxes on things like necessity goods, where the elasticity is, the demand elasticity is definitely, it's highly inelastic, because the price change is not going to be huge. Why? Well, because it's kind of a necessity good. Tobacco is not a necessity good, but sort of, tobacco, alcohol, these are addictive goods. And so demand is quite inelastic. Electricity, water, the utilities, again, these are necessity goods, and so their demands are also inelastic. Anyway, after this, the final part of this question, by the way. Okay. The question is, how the consumer-producer surplus changes. What happens to government's revenue? What's the deadweight loss after tax? Well, simple. I'm not going to calculate them mathematically, but let me just show the areas. So this is the consumer surplus. All right. Why? Well, because the consumers pay $7 per good. So the area between the demand curve and the price line determines the consumer surplus. What about the producer surplus? So this is CS. The producer surplus is the area between the price line and the supply curve. So it is this area. So this is the producer surplus. Clearly, both producer and consumer surplus shrinks relative to no tax scenario. What else? Well, this area, this rectangle, the size is tax times quantity. You need to find this quantity, by the way. But it's easy, right? Once you know the price for the sellers, go to the supply curve and plug this price. Where is the supply curve? So here the P is PS. So when it's 4, QS is 6. All right? Or alternatively, choose the buyer's price and go to the demand curve. And whenever you see price, it's going to be the buyer's price, plug 7. So this is 14, 20 minus 14, again 6. All right? So this is the how much good will be traded, much less than 8. All right? Before tax, there were 8 products sold, but now it's going to be 6. All right, so this area, therefore, 3 times 6, 18 units, is the government tax revenue. And then finally, obviously, this small triangle that goes no one is called deadweight loss. By the way, how can we sure that it is a loss? Well, look, in this picture, in this very simple picture, there are 3 players who can benefit. These are like, I don't want to use this word, but yeah, these are 3 parties who benefit from this market. The consumers, obviously, they consume. The producers, they sell and make money. And then the government extracts money, revenue. And then who else? That's it. Buyers, sellers, and government. There's no other player. However, we know in perfectly competitive market, the entire total surplus was equal to this entire, this is not a triangle, but this entire area, including this red region. So that was the total surplus. But now this red area is consumed by no one, all right? It's not consumer, it's not part of consumer surplus, not part of producer surplus, not part of anything. So what does that mean? That means basically this part goes no one, so it's trashed, it's garbaged. And so we call it loss, deadweight loss. This is the name we attach. And basically this is how we solve this question.